I am going to start our final discussion here of today's conference, and I've got a very diverse panel, which I'm really excited to be able to introduce and to have us kind of have this conversation involving representatives from the Hill, survivor communities, advocates, researchers, and grant makers who all play a critical role in helping to advance civil society's efforts when it comes to atrocity prevention. And maybe just to provide a little bit of scene setting in regards to the role of civil society, I think it would be fair when we take stock of advances we've made over the last few decades. Civil society has continued to be the engine for atrocity prevention efforts. They've built the norms that we rely on and fight for today, from Raphael Lemkin stalking the halls of the UN, pushing for genocide to be recognized. They've developed the roadmaps for how governments and institutions can institutionalize atrocity prevention, just thinking about the work that this institution did on the Genocide Prevention Task Force, or others like the Global Center for R2P have been doing on R2P focal points. They're the canaries in the coal mine, pointing to the risks of atrocities, the early warning system that we've launched, the work of advocates and survivors like Waiwainu, Rohingya advocate. They are peacemakers, thinking of the women in Plateau State, Nigeria, who work every day to bring together individuals from different faiths to counter intercommunal tension. They're the catalysts for preventive and protective action, the work that Matt Smith and others are doing at Fortify Rights, the work that Crisis Action, Human Rights Watch, and others do every day. They document our failures, Amnesty International's work, the work of so many human rights organizations and humanitarian organizations around the world, the work of those like Guatemalan forensic experts who collect and preserve the bones of those who have been killed. And they are our conscience, calling for accountability and for recognition of what has happened. I think there of groups like the Mothers of Plaza de Mayo, who for decades walked calling for truth and justice in the cases of their family members that were missing. Today, in some ways, we are better placed to act than ever. We have more tools available to help cast light on atrocities that are occurring. We have more means today to communicate with the world about what is happening in hard-to-reach places. We also have more opportunities to coordinate. But at this particular time, there are also considerable challenges, and I suspect that many of the panelists here will highlight what some of those challenges are in how we can work together better to try to partner and advance the goal of never again. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to our first panelists. Each of the panelists have been asked to share a little bit about themselves, the work that they do, how it relates to atrocity prevention, and share some early reflections on the role of civil society in atrocity prevention. Qutaiba.
Thank you, Naomi, and thanks everyone for being here. Thanks for Cameron and the Holocaust Museum for your tremendous work always on this subject. My name is Qutaiba Idlbi. I come from Syria. Professionally, I come from banking background. On a personal level, I come from more interfaith and human rights background. I grew up in Syria. My dad was an interfaith and peace leader in Syria. I used to go with him to a lot of meetings when I was a kid. Kind of like what got me involved when the revolution started in Syria. I was kind of like the connection between international media and civil society on the ground. So I would report to CNN, Sky News, BBC, other media outlets on what is going on the ground, which led to me being detained twice by the Syrian government, tortured, and then later exiled from the country. Traveled around the region and then ended up coming to the United States, where I started a small organization called People Demand Change, along with two amazing colleagues, a former Syrian diplomat and an American activist. In People Demand Change, when we first started, our focus was to be the platform for civil society in Syria to reach the international community, whether it is decision makers or funders. So we provide the legal and the legal platform and the access for organizations on the ground first to reach out to funders and be able to get funding to continue their work, to survive as activists as well, from funders directly without going through all the channels that usually aid and development implementers or CSOs and NGOs goes to reach to get funding. And secondly, to echo their voices, because basically civil society organizations, especially in the case of Syria, becoming the voice of civilians and the main actors that represent the society. Yeah, that's me.
Good. Thank you. My name is Brian Joseph. I'm the Senior Director for Asia and Global Programs at the National Endowment for Democracy, which, for those of you who don't know, is a Washington, D.C.-based, congressionally funded non-governmental organization. And we fund civil society projects around the world. We work in non-democratic and transitioning countries. And it was interesting when I was preparing for today's talk, I was flipping through the Holocaust Museum's new book on democracy prevention, on atrocity prevention. I'll get to my point, which is, and there's an interesting chart, and there are about 9 different things they point to as key aspects of prevention, atrocity prevention, and actually they're all just the tools of democracy promotion. And so there's a real overlap between the work of groups like mine and others who are engaged in political reform, human rights, minority rights, the whole spectrum of political participation, and the work of atrocity prevention. But the interesting thing when you're asking us about the connection, my experience, and I've been doing this for a few decades now, is that the terms that people use matter, and people use different terms. And so these terms that we're throwing around today, conflict resolution, mass atrocity, genocide, are not how any of the groups we work with define their work. Although if you ask them what they did, the groups in Washington and others who are providing the conceptual framework would clearly place their activities squarely inside the prevention toolbox. So that's just one role of civil society. And I just wanted to echo, I do think that there's a huge emphasis, and there should be, on civil society for all the reasons Naomi and other people have mentioned. But I think sometimes we go too far in suggesting that civil society and local organizations, by definition, are the solution to problems. Some of these problems that people are dealing with, and I think Syria is a perfect example, or we'll get to the case of Burma, or if you look at what happened in Sri Lanka, it's not always within the means and the ability of local organizations, no matter how skilled, to deal with the problems they face. So conflict resolution, if it's 2 small warring factions, perhaps that's it, if it's a small communal tension. But when you get to things that mount to mass atrocity, where the government and government institutions and the security sector are deeply involved, I think it's a mistake for us to think and sort of push all of the tools, or most of the tools, or responsibility to the local organizations. And let me just end on that for the introduction.
Thanks, Brian. Hi, everyone. Thanks to the organizers and all of you for being here. It's a great opportunity to be here with you. I'm Matthew Smith. I work with an organization called Fortify Rights. We are a young and growing human rights organization. We're based in Southeast Asia, registered in the US, registered in Geneva. All of our work is taking place now in Myanmar, Thailand, and also Malaysia. We've heard a little bit, Myanmar, Burma, force of habit, we're referring to the country as Myanmar. Much of our work is focused on the situation facing Rohingya Muslims, and I'll be happy to talk a little bit about that today. But just by way of introductions, I'll explain a little bit about how we do what we do. We have 3 words that we use to describe our work: investigate, engage, and strengthen. By investigate, much of our investigations take place much in the same way that human rights work has been done for many years. We get as close as possible to situations of abuse, to where human rights violations are taking place. We speak with survivors, eyewitnesses, in some cases perpetrators of human rights violations. And we analyze that information within the context of international human rights law and humanitarian law. We produce reports, op-eds, press releases. Since 2013, we've produced about 70 different publications. So that work is happening. In terms of engage, this is a very important aspect of our work as well. We engage, we take the information that we've collected, we engage people with power, we engage the news media, in some cases anybody that'll listen to us. And we try to do that work alongside our local partners. So we try to do that work alongside communities. And one of the things that we've talked about is this rather pernicious idea that persecuted groups can't objectively represent themselves. And this is something that we work against through our mandate. We're trying to strengthen the work of human rights defenders who are in these situations. And whenever human rights violations are happening, there are always local responses to those abuses. So one of our objectives, and that's the third point, is to strengthen those local responses to abuses. And the strengthening work that we do comes in areas like workshops, trainings, other types of support to activists on the ground who are documenting and defending their human rights. So I think that would sum it up for Fortify Rights. Thanks.
Hi, my name is Charlotte Oldham-Moore, and I work for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. Can you hear me? I can't. Okay. For Senator Ben Cardin, who spoke earlier this morning. He's the ranking minority member. I've been a consumer of Matthew's materials and also Qutaiba's materials and briefings, and I'm really, really honored to be here with them because we draw on their work constantly. I've worked for several senators, a little bit at the State Department and NGOs, and now I'm with Senator Cardin, who's been a real leader in the building in the Capitol on human rights, on accountability, on ending impunity, on democracy, on anti-corruption, on a whole range of issues that I help staff him on. And these are, as we all know, impunity and corruption, for example, often lead to feelings of grievances that go unaddressed and can blow up and can lead to conflicts and can lead to mass atrocities when you don't have any of the systems in place of good governance to counter that. We've worked with the Holocaust Museum. We've worked with lots of people in this audience on the issue of mass atrocities prevention and genocide prevention. And one of the things that I realized when I was at State is that the Atrocity Prevention Board in particular was doing really excellent work, that the U.S. government at State and USAID were doing tremendous work in developing the tools and looking closely at areas over the horizon where indications of atrocities may be taking place and using the tools in their toolkit, diplomatic sanctions, all kinds of stuff they can bring to bear on burgeoning threats. But the people really had no idea about that. And I think the APB secrecy or lack of transparency or under the radar is important because it helps because they deal with classified material and they deal with diplomatic relationships. The downside is for many years they haven't been able to share with the public and with lawmakers it's their value. And so I think a lot of misinformation grew up on the Hill about what the APB, President Obama's atrocity prevention through PSD10's efforts were about. So Senator Cardin and I talked about this, and he decided that he wanted to do a bill that would be a comprehensive look at how we could institutionalize some of the initiatives that the administration had developed, and also give authorities to the Complex Crisis Fund, which isn't authorized, and strengthen some other areas for the next administrations that might come. And I worked very closely with a coalition of civil society organizations, and we cannot do our work on the Hill without you guys. Incredible expertise, knowledge, passion, and just energy. We worked with the coalition to prevent and working group on prevention and protection. And there are dozens and dozens of organizations, including FCNL, Humanity United, I can't list them all. And they helped us with this bill, develop it in terms of getting the policy right, talking about the process, how we would move it through the system. And it's been enormously helpful to that effort. So Senator Cardin earlier this year with Tom Tillis, a Republican from North Carolina, introduced this bill. We have 25 co-sponsors. And the notion is to institutionalize some of the tools we've talked about all day, institutionalize them, give them legs, give them permanent hard legs, not legs of sand, so that when the next administration comes in, these processes don't just disappear. So civil society has been absolutely critical to this effort because, as you all know, you can have all the tools in your kit, but without pressure on policymakers or decision makers, whatever you want to call them, to use the tools, to fund the tools, to take action when there are indications of conflict or atrocities. Those tools can collect cobwebs. So it's been really important in terms of the Congress because it's a very complicated environment politically. I don't know, the politics of this issue are quite complicated, and we can talk about that later. But so just briefly, the civil society has been very, very important. Historically, I think policymakers do have information, but without the political pressure to actually act on that information, they won't. And so the groups I've been working with have, I think, up to 700 meetings in the House and the Senate about atrocity prevention. Just extraordinary. And I've really seen really remarkable progress on mainstreaming understanding about this issue, which very few people understand. It's a very technocratic crowd. Victims understand it very well. Survivors understand it very well. But the rest, it's the language, the terms used are not accessible to people. People's eyes kind of glazed over. So this effort is impossible without all the NGOs, particularly that I've worked with in DC or who come through like Matthew, who give us the information on what's happening to the Rohingya in Malaysia, everywhere. We look forward to his brief, every 6 months. But so anyway, that's all I have to say.
That was great. Thank you very much. I mean, you do such fascinating and diverse work and such critical work. I'm curious because there was a couple commonalities in what you were talking about. I think, Brian, you started off with talking about words mattering and saying how there are many different organizations that you work with who work on related issues but are not necessarily using the same common terminology and perhaps don't have the same platforms. And I'm just curious because, Matthew, you're building coalitions to help advance your work. Qutaiba, you've been involved in coalitions as well, and that was something that Charlotte stressed as being so critical. How do you, in each of your own work, how have you found opportunities to build those types of coalitions to overcome the hurdles that arise as a result of perhaps kind of some of these issues being pigeonholed, or, in the case of the work that you've been doing, Matthew, even people not necessarily understanding some of the nuances and challenges around the plight of the Rohingya, even domestically. So I'm curious just on overcoming those challenges and hurdles to build the coalitions that you're talking about. And maybe, Charlotte, just from your vantage point, can you think of one or two coalitions that have been particularly effective, perhaps on past cases that you've worked on, that maybe would serve as a model here in Washington for how organizations working on atrocity prevention can work more effectively together?
So one or two what?
Examples of past coalitions, perhaps on other agenda
Other
items.
issues, yeah.
I don't know if...
Okay. I mean, in general, I think it's important when we talk about that is talk actually about the challenges that CSOs in general on the ground they face themselves. And when we talk, I mean, in Syria, in the past 5-6 years, civil society organizations have done tremendous work, amazing the amount of work and the energy they're spending on the work and the circumstances that civil society inside Syria is facing. And when we talk about civil society inside Syria, it's a very broad term because civil society covers basically humanitarian aid work up to local governing. All of the work that basically there is no government or there is no institutions to do, civil society is doing. That's in Syria specifically, that's what civil society covers. And in general, when we talk about CSOs inside Syria, there are like two main challenges that they're facing. The first thing is the lack of experience and the lack in their and the need for a very well-through capacity building training, because when in the situation in Syria, like NGOs has been introduced recently to how like the international funding system has been working, and how in general to work on reporting, on doing their finances, on applying for funds, or even on writing proposals. For us, it was when we started working with NGOs on the ground, we realized that we actually need to start with the basics with those organizations, just to provide them with the needed training to be able at least just to know, and even to put a structure how the funding mechanism works, even inside the U.S. government or in general. The second thing that's the second challenge that CSOs are facing is actually not having the right funding for long term. When we talk about the funding that goes on the ground, so we have the what we call in civil society, in Syria and in Yemen as well, we call the aid whales, which are like the prime funders that they get funding directly from the government, hundreds of millions of dollars, and then they shift funding to medium organizations after getting 35% for overhead. So those organizations, when the funds get to the organization on the ground, basically, they get a fund to run a project 3 to 6 months, basically, with the minimum, sometimes with no overhead to run their own organizations. So they only get the money to run a project on the ground to run their operations. So trying through like the platform that we created through PDC, basically, we tried actually to kind of like decrease that circle that goes on from the government, that fund, like that gives the fund out to the CSO on the ground. So we gave the opportunity to local groups on the ground, after being vetted thoroughly, to use our legal platform to get in contact directly with the funders. So CSOs on the ground who been like in besieged areas in Ghouta or in Madaya or in Daraya, they were able to get through, let's say, for example, apply for funds from NEA or from DRL and State Department through using our own registration. In return, PDC can only run for them their financial reporting by the end, so because we are legally responsible for all the funds they're getting. But they got the chance actually to get a direct fund without going through all these channels that takes a lot from the funds they're getting. And those challenges are very hard for CSOs, because they are the ones who are acting basically, especially in Syria, in giving the early warnings for atrocities in the absence of the international NGOs. And the reason behind that is when the conflict in Syria started, on the Syrian government side, the Syrian government gave the option for international NGOs either to work in government-controlled areas or in opposition-held areas. The UN basically, or the big agencies under the UN, they were able to operate under the government controlled areas under a condition that they would be kind of neutrally negative in what is going on. So for example, and this is also something that in preventing atrocities, and when we talk about atrocities at civil society, this is something that truly hurts, is when international actors talk, for example, about stopping violence from all sides, which is basically what civil society wants, actually, to stop the violence. But this is actually helping when the violence is 99% being committed by the Syrian government, for example. Then this is when we say we should need to stop violence from all sides without really telling which sides are really making like the huge amount of the atrocities. We're actually helping those sides just to continue their work, because we're giving them the umbrella to continue the work they're doing, as, oh, everyone is doing violence, so it's fine for them to continue. So that was also like a big challenge, to give the platform to those small CSOs that have no voice, that have no connections, actually to have the connections to deliver the message. One recent case we had was Madaya, besieged Madaya. We had over 40,000 people in the besieged town of Madaya. There was no food, no aid, no baby milk, no medical supplies, not even water supplies in some cases, allowed into that town for almost more than 14 months. When the UN report about the besieged areas in Syria was done, it was sent to the Syrian government to be edited. And the Syrian government changed the how those areas are put in the report from besieged areas to hard to reach areas. So an area basically that gets, as Madaya, that gets no milk, no food, no medical support, nothing literally, where people literally had to eat the leaves of the trees, what was put as hard to reach. So it was only because of the voice of the organizations working on the ground, because of the local hospitals, and then the organizations, Syrian and American organizations, working especially in Washington D.C. It was their mission actually to deliver the voice of the people living there, to actually for the UN to admit that actually Madaya is besieged, and then to put pressure on the Syrian government to deliver aid to those areas. So those are, basically the main challenges that civil society faces.
Thank you.
Yeah, sure. On the issue of terms mattering, this is a very important point, and I would agree 100%. A few years ago, in I guess it was 2013, I was involved in the production of a report that alleged ethnic cleansing and crimes against humanity were taking place against Rohingya Muslims in Rakhine State. At the time, the diplomatic community and the so-called international community, of course behind closed doors, were saying that we had gone far too, this was a report with Human Rights Watch, that we had gone too far in alleging ethnic cleansing. There was very little mention of crimes against humanity, actually, which is a far more serious allegation, given that ethnic cleansing technically is not a crime. Fast forwarding to today, when the term genocide has been invoked with regard to the situation of Rohingya Muslims in Myanmar, the center at the museum here, Andrea Gittleman and the rest of the team did an excellent report last year, a very timely report on the warning signs of genocide. Other organizations, Yale Law School's Lowenstein Human Rights Clinic has done a legal analysis about the crime of genocide in Myanmar. The special advisor to the Secretary General on the issue of genocide recently also mentioned the situation of Rohingya with respect to the crime of genocide and issued a warning that genocide may take place if the situation doesn't improve. So these are all terms that obviously are very heavy, but even just to take a step back, the word Rohingya itself in Myanmar is a contested term. So when we talk about terms matter, the very word that this population uses to identify themselves is contested, denied, rejected, even by the current democratically elected government. So terms matter. Rohingya have been trafficked. Some say they've been smuggled. There's a profound amount of confusion on the difference between human trafficking and human smuggling. And so those terms matter as well. In terms of overcoming hurdles, we use as our basis international law. Many of these terms have definitions, and we turn to those definitions when our interlocutors, in our view, are confused on these issues. But in terms of working with civil society, our partners and organizations, and in some cases individual human rights defenders, there are some obstacles, particularly around these issues, to mobilizing people. But there are a number of challenges in Southeast Asia right now that we face beyond that. Security is a big issue. In many of the places where we're operating and our colleagues are operating are very inhospitable to human rights organizations, to human rights activists. So we spend an agonizing amount of time dealing with security situations to make sure that what we're doing, that we will do no harm, and that what we're doing will have the desired impacts. Impunity for these crimes is a big issue as well. But there's always reason for hope. We work with a number of very inspiring and amazing partners, and of course everybody up here and many of you out there, all of you out there as well. So yeah, thanks.
It's a good segue to what I was going to say, Matt, which is, Matt mentioned in the case of Myanmar or Burma, it represents, I think, the strength of the civil society, what civil society can do. This is, and almost all of the groups that Matt mentioned, particularly the international ones, have been working on this for 20 years. And the coalitions that have built up among groups in Washington, the European capitals, and equally importantly in the Asian capitals, has been essential to building the strength of the movement that allows for the documentation. So the local actors in the field who are the front line of getting the documentation, working with groups like Fortify Rights and others who are able to then tabulate it, analyze it, and then having strong advocates in the capital cities that matter. So in the case of Burma, it was European capitals. For a while, it was Bangkok, Jakarta, other places. But having that strength of a global coalition that ties together advocacy, international advocacy at the UN, but really it's all based on the work of local actors and the ability to get into the areas that are most affected is critical. I also just wanted to say, I think we're talking about the issue of mass atrocity and genocide. These are not easy, right? Coalition building in these areas is very, very difficult. And I would just mention, I think even if you look at Burma today, Matt mentioned that the new National League for Democracy government is not on board with certain terminology, the prioritization of issues. And so you even have the struggle that needs to take place of educating and building coalitions among Democrats, liberal activists inside the country who simply either do not understand the issue or simply disagree with you. And that understanding that civil society represents a diversity of interests and a diversity of opinion is essential. If you think about civil society as a group of like-minded, similarly acting organizations, it misses the point. So the coalitions, and I can just speak from my experience doing this for a long time, even among people fighting for the exact same objective, have significant disagreements about strategy and tactics. And finding a way to get these groups to work together, to at least collaborate, to have the information shared, and to continue to work towards that same agenda, recognizing that you need a diversity of strategies and approaches is a real challenge. But just in this case in particular, it's every step you take is it's a minefield.
Yeah, so I guess on the coalition question that you raised earlier on, I was a part of a different struggle, if that's a word, in the trafficking, well, let me back up. One of my bosses, an excellent, very fine senator, often says that the only way you get anything done in the Capitol or in the Congress is and the only way you can be successful as a staffer is to be able to get your policy right, your process right, and your politics right. And I think that goes to this issue as well. I think you guys help us with the policies. You tell us what works, what doesn't. The technocratic set in DC does that. The think tanks do that. But the problem with really institutionalizing or broadening your base of support is you've got to get the politics right. And I did see that on the trafficking. In 2000, I think it was 2000, I'm losing track of time, in 2010, I helped work in a coalition that drafted the Trafficking Victims Protection Act. And my view is the only way you get good things done in this town is if it's bipartisan. And that was a very much strongly rooted Republican Democratic effort with folks. I worked for Senator Wellstone, a very liberal labor movement guy, lashed up with Senator Brownback, who's now governor of Kansas, who is very seized by sex trafficking. So we worked together, got a bill done, and it's, I think, had a difference. People may not like what it did, but I think it's definitely had a difference. And I think it's the bill, and the problem with the mass atrocity or the genocide issue, it's a hard issue because you have to humanize it, and you have to have, it's, in some ways it's easier to kind of not sell, but communicate the narrative of a victim of sex trafficking. You can show that child, you can have that child come into the office talk, or the survivor of sex trafficking. You can do that with survivors of mass atrocities, but it's not being done. We've had Wei New, we've had many extraordinary people come up to the Hill, because you have to have that heart connection, I think, to really mobilize action genuinely by most people, and this interpersonal piece is tremendously important. We also have to work on, I believe, a Sanders and a Cruz supporter, Ted Cruz supporter or a Bernie Sanders supporter. Both, if you talk to them in language that would make sense to them, both would support their government working to develop tools and possibly interventions to prevent mass atrocities. But the strategies you would use to explain that are different. And I think this coalition needs to be able to develop strategies not only to talk to liberal Democrats or moderate Republicans, but conservative Republicans or extremely left-leaning Democrats who are non-interventionist in a lot of levels now. And so we're living in a world that's quite different. People are war-weary, they're exhausted, many people really are beleaguered by what they perceive as the limitations of U.S. power. So we're dealing in a very different environment, I think. One other thing on the narratives, you've got to confront Syria. I think a lot of people particularly my Republican colleagues across the aisle, would say, look, we've had lots of initiatives, lots of tools in our toolkit, but 450,000 people have been killed in the last 5 years, and that's probably a low estimate, and millions are displaced. And we're seeing atrocities in Libya. We're seeing atrocities, we did see, I believe, in Rakhine. We're seeing them in South Sudan. We have to be able to explain what happened with Syria, and I think we haven't been able to do that effectively enough. What else? And also, I think one of the pushbacks on some of the Atrocity Prevention Board is there's a critique in this town about the National Security Council becoming too strong. There's a kind of a centralization of power in the White House, and do you want to enhance that? That's something we've got to be able to talk about and have answers to. So I guess on coalitions, they've got to be bipartisan if you want to be effective, and you've got to create ways to talk about these issues to a multiplicity of listeners and not just to our friends,
I think that's a good point to turn to the audience for questions from those that are here, but also I believe that there are questions that are coming through Twitter as well. There's a gentleman in the back.
My name is Jason Lawson. I work for U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. And sort of, I guess, the broader picture view of my job that I see myself is kind of combating denials. I'm a little curious on how do you see denials, people who will sit there with a straight face and basically say the Holocaust didn't happen, despite mountains and mountains of evidence. Like, how do you see civil society in combating denialism that will probably inevitably happen 10, 15, 20 years down the road with many of the current situations?
Thank you for that question. Is there another question as well? We could take maybe more than one at the same time. Okay, we'll start with that.
I think if I can just jump in and offer the question from Twitter.
Oh, yes, please. Thanks.
So one of our tweeters asked, sometimes engaging civil society creates risks for, specifically engaging civil society abroad creates risks for the individuals with whom advocates in DC are trying to build relationships. So specifically for those of you on the panel who work on the ground in countries at high risk of mass atrocities, how do you go about mitigating the risks for those activists and making the calculated choices involved in mitigating those risks?
You want to go ahead?
Yeah, sure. No, go ahead.
Up to you.
I'll start with the second question. I think, like in general, when doing policy, especially in reaching out to decision makers, I think this is one of the hardest things to do. From one side, what you mentioned about each one's in general, the community or like the individual's security and how is that would reflect on them, especially when bringing witnesses of atrocities in town to talk to policymakers about what they saw. We've seen in the case of Caesar, the guy who smuggled 50,000 pictures of the detainees who died under torture in Syria from inside the Syrian government, for his own security, even though other groups on the ground managed to get him out with at least 60 members of his family out of Syria. But even for his own security, it wasn't even okay for him even to show his face and his identity. Because it is based on legitimate fear of what the government can do to him. Other members also who come to here, we bring here to talk also with people on the Hill or at State Department, civil society actors who come from inside Syria. They don't want to talk about their trips here because they're afraid if they come back also on the ground, that means other groups would come after them for coming here. So it's kind of all left, at least from our side, on the individual's decisions on what they think is okay for them and what is not. We cannot really decide. We can see what is reasonable and what is not, but you can't really decide for anyone's safety. They're the ones to decide whether it's okay for them to take the risk or not. On another side, I think also we have a problem with the messaging. we always face the problem of like saying what is politically correct or not as civil society actors. And in cases like Syria, less Yemen, I would say, Iraq, we didn't see that problem. It wasn't really okay for civil society actors to deliver direct messages. That is all about protecting civilians, like the idea of Planet Syria or like no-fly zones in Syria. It's always delivered as this is a political questioning. This is more a political demand or to help one party against the other. But it is actually a humanitarian-based need inside Syria that really a lot of civilians, and when we talk about internally displaced people, those are actually just left on the borders because they cannot reach outside or like they cannot go anywhere else. We're talking about more than 6 million people. So if we cannot really linking those demands to also political agendas was really harmful for the society in general. On the messaging also from another side, using I think not wrong messages was also harmful. In the case of that, for example, when calling what ISIS was doing in Syria a genocide, and then leaving what Assad did, which is, I mean, if I would say at least 50 doubles more than what ISIS did in Syria, leaving it and what's targeting specifically Sunni communities in more than 99% of the cases. When leaving this out, we were just sending messages to Sunnis or Muslims in Syria or in the region in general who are facing ISIS, that it doesn't matter for the international community if you die, but it only matters if minorities die. And this is, I mean, in a way or another, this was helping fueling ISIS propaganda. To tell people, all the world let you go, you only have us to come and join us.
Let me be brief on this. I absolutely agree. There's a huge risk for civil society actors in these countries who are on the ground engaged in the most difficult situations, and there's no way around it. And I absolutely agree with Qutaiba. You have to defer to a large degree to the local actors to set their own standards for the risks they're willing to take. That said, there are lots and lots of tools that can be taught and shared with activists on the ground to help mitigate some of those risks. So there is some responsibility, but I think it's really about awareness, making sure that those engaged in it from afar know who you're working with, know the tools at your disposal, make sure that the people are making calculated risks, that that they're doing it for the reasons that you would expect. But also to say, even when it's not the most extreme, I can just give you a few examples. In Sri Lanka, for example, where the war is now a few years over, there's still tremendous risk that people are taking to document what happened. And that goes to, I think, the question in the back about the denialism. Mm-hmm. That there is a need to document, and my personal experience is there's certain people you will never convince of certain things, but you need to document this. You need to document it at the time, you need to document it after the fact, and you need to make sure it's rigorous, it's as thorough as possible, it meets certain criteria, and it's an ongoing process. So in Sri Lanka, people are still documenting things that happened years ago. In Burma, they're still documenting things that are happening right now. And that need to have documentation that's verifiable, that's credible, is an essential tool of it. And I guess let me end with that. I have another point. I'll come back.
Yeah, just briefly, I would agree completely with the point that in terms of risk assessment, it's ultimately up to whomever the person is who might come to meetings. Also, I think it's worth adding, and this is something we deal with often, is speaking to the media. Survivors of abuses, in some cases in Rakhine State, people who are confined to internment camps, undertake enormous risk when they speak to journalists who are visiting for a very brief period of time to do their work. And we have seen situations in which people are courageous to a fault, and we've had conversations with them about risk assessment and that. But people have been arrested, detained, hunted by the Myanmar authorities. Some of this is happening just a matter of weeks ago, probably happening right at this moment, actually. So the risk is, I wouldn't say it's 100% up to the individual to decide, because we're all in this together. We have to take care of each other. And sometimes that involves having a difficult conversation about, what type of risks we all should be taking in these situations. On the denialism, this is an issue that we deal with often, and I think with the crazy people that you mentioned, maybe they'd be difficult to, it's hard to crack that nut. But I think we have seen in Myanmar a number of individuals, government officials, and others bemoan the international media attention on the human rights violations that we've been documenting along with others. And they're very critical. They think it's biased, but ultimately, I think all of this attention, the human rights documentation that Brian mentioned, the international media has done an excellent job covering these issues. All of that has helped chip away at this denialism, and the denialism in Myanmar is multifaceted. You have people denying that the Rohingya people exist. You have people denying that the abuses are taking place. And denying all sorts of things. So the documentation is absolutely essential. I would agree with that. Yeah.
Brian, you mentioned you had another point that you wanted to raise.
No, I was just going to say, going back to, it's the civil side, but in the case of Burma, it's even people who are writing editorials and journalists, how they cover it. They're putting themselves at risk. So even the coverage of this in these communities is so fraught with tension, with actual violence or threats of violence, that people doing the most benign types of reporting on issues like this, even if they're not going out of the way of using certain terms or labeling a genocide, they themselves face risk. So it's really pervasive. And it's something that the groups and the individuals engaged in this are as aware of it as anybody. And I just agree with Matt that it's sort of, you can't always defer 100% to them to make those decisions, but my feeling is that's where you have to start.
Absolutely.
Just out of curiosity, as a follow-up to that, there are a number of governments that have participated in the conversation today, and I'm curious about the role that they can play in assisting civil society when it comes to protection. Is that options for asylum? Is that the sharing of strategies, as you said, that can allow people to kind of bring information out of at-risk areas and minimize their own harm? What are some of the kind of models, and what are some of the requests perhaps that you've even made for greater assistance, either from people on the Hill or for different governments?
Yeah, well, I think we've seen. I think it's very difficult for governments or individuals in governments who are really trying to work in the area of atrocity prevention. A few examples. In some cases, embassies in Myanmar will travel to places where these human rights violations have taken place. And this can be a double-edged sword because it could arguably have a preventative effect, but we also know that the individuals that people from embassies speak to when they go to these places then have faced persecution after those officials leave. And this has happened almost every single time Western diplomats have visited Rakhine State, for example. And so that is a very difficult issue, but I think the international community can absolutely play a role on that level in country. Embassies can raise these issues with the government, and some have, in terms of helping people get released from prison, for example. We've seen that, which has been inspiring. So it's difficult, I guess I would say.
Please go ahead.
I would agree. It's very difficult, and I don't think there's a single answer to it. In certain countries, having the U.S. government stand up and speak out on behalf of people offers them a degree of protection. In other environments, that same action might be counterproductive. But at the same time, I do think that the U.S. government making it clear that the human rights defenders, the people in the front lines of this, are of particular interest to the American government and are part of the calculation of our level of engagement is essential. So even if it's not the ability to actually protect an individual, making it clear and consistent that that expression of concern for people on the front lines for fighting for democracy, human rights, minority rights, whatever you have, are a critical concern of the United States does tend to have an effect.
And one way I just want to say on that is, when I've done trips with senators or at state, really important to have members of Congress or officials from state or whoever, or the government, to meet with civil society in roundtables when they arrive. It provides somewhat an umbrella, not always. Like we did one around the Maidan in Ukraine, and people were harassed afterwards. In different places I've gone, there's a price to pay, but a lot of times these advocates know what that price is. Not always, you're absolutely correct. But I just also want to say that there's a huge amount of accelerating pressure on civil society across the world right now. Press, enormous pressure, and you see it all over. You see it obviously in Russia, in China, the new NGO law, in many countries, and it's accelerating, and it's a very dark cloud, and we've got to be vigilant about it, and we've got to speak about it, because it's extraordinary how many people are in jail right now for things that we just, don't even think twice about.
Qutaiba. Okay, thank you. There's a question right here in the front. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your work. It's really inspiring. My question is probably for Charlotte more than the others. I am working on what's called information architecture in legislatures, and that has to do with how you can use sort of dynamic modeling, big data, algorithmic information gathering for oversight purposes and for interrogation in real time, in some cases for probability modeling, where you can model trade-offs of decisions. And my question always is for civil society, is there anybody doing that kind of robust data gathering in a consistent way that's going to match up with the kind of technology that we're going to see in democratic systems? I know that some of these platforms are going to be piloted in the House, probably in the next few years. The Senate is not as technologically advanced as the House for oversight and deliberation. Do you think this would be useful? Do you see it not becoming a victim of sort of information warfare and politics? And would you like to experiment with that kind of thing in your own oversight duties?
I can barely count, and you have a long divide. So I don't really understand everything you've said. So we would need to talk about it. You're saying that you're setting up platforms in the House to do oversight of legislation?
Actually, it's how do you make sure that deliberative bodies like Congress or other legislatures can be successful in their basic duties in the information age? And the kind of big data that's out there. I mean, I worked on the Hill for 9 years, so I know how hard it is to sort and filter for information. A lot of it's going to become more and more available in these huge data sets. And who you can trust and where the information comes from and the timing of it is going to become much more important. And I would argue that it gives Congress a chance to go toe-to-toe with the executive branch more.
Yeah.
Is that a good thing? Is it not? I mean, what do you see happening with that? Because it is going to happen. And civil society has a huge role to play, because so often it is the only one on the ground, or it is the entity that is most trustworthy. Does that make more sense?
Yeah, I guess it just depends on what the questions the big data is being asked and what's coming out. I mean, I don't fully, this is a big topic. So I look at foreign policy, I look at one set, I look at how state, USAID, intersection of foreign policy. So I'm not sure how this would work with my work, but I'd love to meet with you sometime and talk about it. But I just want to say on data and reporting and all of that, we're in an information age, and I remember when Human Rights Watch switched from collecting data to advocacy, and that was like in the 1990s. And what happened, because there's so much information on the internet, there's so much information, it really comes down to credibility for NGOs and civil society. So I can't say it enough. Maintain your credibility. If you don't get a report that is as interesting as it could be because the data doesn't really drive you there, it's a little dull, put that one out, because credibility is everything in the information age. And once you lose it, policymakers are not going to read your stuff. And so but on your larger topic on how this would affect my work, we'd have to just discuss it. I need to know more. I'm sorry. Okay.
There's a question in the back. Dan, I'm just wondering if there's any questions through Twitter too.
No additional ones that we've seen.
Hi, Dan Sullivan with Refugees International. Wondering how you address the challenge of NGOs that are either kind of quasi or overtly government, and I think that's so civil society that's either partially or fully government kind of backed, and I think in Myanmar, Burma, that's particularly relevant. How do you address working with those groups or figuring out who they are?
I think there was one more question lower down as well.
Yeah, I'd like to make an observation. My name is Al Sutton. I'm with a group called African Freedom Coalition. The 120 congressmen have sent a letter to President Obama, which arrived on his desk on the 4th of May, about the situation in Sudan, a place where genocide has been established for quite some time, and there's a great deal of violence, which is ongoing even today. I have not heard Sudan mentioned except in passing once during this whole day. Is there a particular reason for that? That's to anybody.
Well, I'll just quickly address that. We haven't gone really into specifics into many of the cases of concern that the museum and many of the organizations here are focused on. But it is definitely a situation that we as an institution continue to be very much seized of, and would be happy to talk to you afterwards about that. I think part of the conversation that we've been having over the past few hours has been focusing a lot on the institution and the structures to try to prevent cases, rather than going into the specifics of individual cases. Maybe if we go to the first question.
Yeah, let me take a crack at the Gongo question. There's actually another element to it, which is not even Gongos, but if you Gongos, which for people don't know, government organized NGOs, and these are sort of a fixture of authoritarian regimes where they set up non-governmental organizations to mimic what a non-governmental organization should do. They don't look or smell or act like NGOs, and it's really quite easy in most of these environments to figure out who they are. For example, when we work, we don't work with them. Lots of governmental agencies, in certain situations in development and other sort of non-controversial or political things, often do work with Gongos and quasi-governmental organizations because they're in the best position to actually implement activities. They have the facilities, they have access to power, they have the resources. But I think in the human rights and democracy realm, those types of organizations are really suspect by definition. The ones that there's a grayer line, and Matt might want to say something about it, in a place like Burma, you also have a whole set of NGOs that aren't quite quasi-governmental organizations, but they are close to the government. They are, in essence, working, and this was before the current elected government, that they operated in a space that the government created and allowed them to operate. So those organizations are not really Gongos, but in the sense of the political environment, the level of repression, and as Charlotte mentioned, in certain environments, as it's getting more and more difficult, NGOs have to navigate that space very carefully. Mm-hmm. And so in these authoritarian environments where the government controls the media, registration, banking, an NGO that operates almost always has to make some sort of compromise or deal with the government empowered to work there. That can be quite controversial when you get into this issue in a case like Burma of peace. One of the principal organizations working in that was an institution that fit clearly in that space of non-governmental but close to the government. So it is a real challenge, and I think for those of us engaged in this, understanding how our governments and our aid agencies choose, how far do they go in working with these types of organizations is a fair question. And briefly on Sudan, the reason I didn't mention it, my region starts in Pakistan and goes through China, but we have a big Sudan program.
I think that covers it.
Yeah, no, just on Sudan, we've done a tremendous amount on South Sudan. I think there's a lot of interest in Sudan, and I would refer you to my colleague. We have a team that's really extraordinary on the Senate Foreign Relations, the committee that deals with Sudan and South Sudan. So I think actually there's been a lot of discussion within the buildings about it.
Are there other questions? Maybe if we take, I think, probably the last two questions.
So I'm really curious about the question of silos and territoriality in the civil society sector. When it comes to the issue of genocide, obviously you can say maybe 20 or so communities have been affected by something either definitely defined as genocide or like it in the last 100 or so years. yet. I'm curious to know about opportunities or examples where these groups are interacting together. In the particular work that I'm doing regarding memory, I can't tell you, even my rabbi said I couldn't even get the Muslim community, Jewish members of my community to be willing to walk with members of the Muslim community on Holocaust Remembrance Day, or other institutions saying, if you read names of victims of other genocides on the day that we preserve memory of our genocide, we won't give you X million of names. Choose another day. And I can understand and respect some of the autonomy there, but also my hypothesis is once we can transcend the silos, we can probably be largely more effective, because any example of civil movements have been combinations of folks from different sort of walks of life. So my question would just be, how might we move forward in that sense? So like Matthew, you're working mostly in Myanmar. Qutaiba, you're focusing on Syria. What can we do? What is the Holocaust Museum doing to kind of further that cause? Thank you.
Would it be fair to translate that question into, is it possible to have a global campaign on atrocity prevention or a global movement on atrocity prevention that transcends individual cases?
That's a great idea.
And there was one more question.
So, funnily enough, my question kind of goes against this idea, which is great. So, basically, I mean, the comment that the gentleman over here raised about we haven't talked enough perhaps about Sudan, and you quite accurately said, well, there's a lot of cases actually that we haven't mentioned because we're talking about structure. And what that immediately made me think about was the challenges that we face when we are talking about structure, because each country that's facing conflict has a different set of concerns, cultural norms, concerns, politics, regional actors that have a play in how things are occurring. So I guess my question is, how do we balance this? How do we address the inherent needs of individual states and nations and regimes to prevent atrocity and genocide while using almost a blunt tool, which is an infrastructure that's meant to account for all? So how do we kind of find that balance?
Who would like to start?
I think you should, Naomi. You've got the global view.
I guess, well, maybe what I do
and
is
then
maybe
while you're
I'm
doing
gonna,
that, talk about the Senate tech stuff, because you do have a problem.
I'm going to perhaps pose it more as a question. I guess I would want to know, if there was going to be a global movement, what are the asks that one can have for a global movement on atrocity prevention? What is it, giving into the point that was made before about different governments, different governmental structures? What is it as a people that we're trying to actually do when we work together in a coalition along those lines? Is it getting governments to reaffirm their commitments to the responsibility to protect and atrocity prevention? Is it getting other governments to do something like the executive order and a high-level statement of priority, as the U.S. government has done and no other government has done at this particular point? Is it seeing they're coalescing around certain actions that one would see in the Security Council, prohibition on the veto? Is it domestic infrastructure that needs to exist because some countries themselves are at risk of atrocity? Or is it a common expression of just support for this notion of never again? I'm curious about what a movement could be that would allow Qutaiba working on Syria and those of you working on Burma and other cases in Southeast Asia to have a common point of reference, civilian protection, R2P. What are the components of it? And I don't know if that's something that you all could comment on.
Yeah, I could.
Go ahead.
I think it's a great idea for a few reasons, but I think when we've seen part of the sort of strengthening side of our work involves bringing people together in workshops and trainings and actually we've worked with NED and our partners at AJWS are here and others to organize events where or space or time for activists to come together to talk strategy, to share information, to spend time with each other. And I think we've seen some very inspiring, very interesting things happen. And these are people who are essentially from the same country or even same community. I've also, over the years, seen situations in which activists or directly affected communities from different places and disparate situations in some cases being affected by completely separate types of abuses come together, and the same type of thing can happen. So people can hatch plans and strategies, show solidarity with one another, develop relationships, and so this is something that, but also recognizing that there are very different dynamics at play and very different situations. But I think for various organizations to come to appreciate that could be very powerful. And so we would definitely support something like that.
Yeah, no, I think that's a terrific idea, and I think it's actually going to become eminently more possible and more important in the years ahead, because as all you know in this audience, the number of crises in the world, conflicts in the world, about 15. They're growing. It's proliferating, and part of it is that states aren't able to maintain systems inside. You're seeing a lot of civil wars that are, bleeding out and causing regional instability. And so this notion of a global need to reaffirm our first principles to international humanitarian law, to civilian protection, I think we've got to kind of go back to first principles. I really see an erosion of things that we took for granted. As you all know, bombing of hospitals, bombing of schools, just extraordinary things are happening, and I think it's going to get worse before it gets better. In Yemen, we're seeing some of the same things that we saw in Syria. I mean, hundreds and hundreds of doctors have been killed in Syria, and you're seeing the attack on civilian infrastructure in Yemen. You're going to see it elsewhere, and the use of refugees as sort of bargaining chips between great powers. The global movement is really, I think, what we're all going to have to be contending with over the next decade. And I personally, maybe I'm just a very grim person, but I think it's going to get worse. And we have really got to get ready to push back and not lose ground. I think we're losing ground right now, let alone taking this movement farther.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, with both of what you guys have said, I think there's a huge need for that sort of global sharing. The challenge, though, to be frank about it, is I think that it's hard for people to engage in something as amorphous as mass atrocity. So people, in my experiences, like when I started, I was in college and it was the apartheid movement. Yeah. There was something very concrete, or in the 90s, the Tibet movement or the Burma movement. These are just the ones I'm more familiar with, but South Sudan, Darfur, that there's certain things that really resonate with people. And it's almost now that there's so many problems and there's so much mayhem in places that where do you begin to engage in a way that you feel that you're being effective? And doing it in a way that whether it's your synagogue or your church or your local group says, this is our cause, and we're going to focus on Syria, or we're going to focus on this place for whatever reason. And then, as Matt said, linking them up with others, because the strategies that groups pursue are important. Learning the local politics, getting young people once again re-engaged in the world and understanding that the United States, or in the U.S., has a role to play, I think is critical. And that has to be the basis of it. If not, you sort of just throw up your hands, like, where do we begin? And there's a huge amount that can be done if we do it. And I would just say one thing that I was just saying, if I may, a slight frustration that I kept hearing. We heard today about tools and tools and tools. And I kept thinking, we know it's not a shortage of tools. It's not a shortage of all these things people talk about. In a case like Syria, it's a decision our government chose not to do something, not because we didn't know what we could or couldn't do. And so as we focus on this, there are lots of tools in the world, and we all know what they are. Some of them work in the short term, some of them work in the long term, hopefully. But I wouldn't hide behind the idea that we keep needing to build tools. We need to build real commitment to this idea, as Charlotte said, that there's a shared humanity and value, and that you might focus on South Sudan or in Burma or Syria, but that there's something that links all of them together.
I couldn't say more, and totally agree with what Brian mentioned. I'd like to mention actually a little small story. My uncle, when I was a little kid, he was one of the judges at Miss Lebanon competition. So sometimes he would take me actually with him. Yeah. Nice. and I learned a lot from him. But yeah. But I once asked him actually, I told him like why all the girls would say like, oh, what do you want to do in the future? What are your hopes? They would say like world peace. And he told me, because who would say no to world peace? I mean, we talk about all the differences between, different genocides and different atrocities, but when you really bring a personal story to someone, and this is also about denial as well, when you really bring a personal story to someone and tell them, this is what happened, and this is what I faced, and this is what people are going through. I mean, in my own experience, it's really hard for anyone to argue with that, to tell that really that this didn't happen, that I cannot really sympathize with that. It's really hard for anyone to do so. And when we work, we worked in Syria, Iraq, and Yemen. Although in the nature the conflicts are different, but when you really look at what civil society is facing, what the community is facing, it's actually a lot of similar stuff. Targeting, as we said, hospitals, or targeting civilian structures, targeting media and activists, using refugees as tools, using starvation as a tool of war. Everywhere you go, criminals are using the same tools in every different atrocity. It's really easy, at least, to start. If we don't want to name names, to say let's at least have, as Brian said, have commitment to what we already agreed on to stand against starvation, to stand against human trafficking. All of these ideals that we should obviously be standing for, we actually kind of denying or ignoring for now. If we just go back to that, and believe me, I remember after first time I knew about Rwanda, and then the first time after I left Syria, I read thoroughly about it. I remember I couldn't stop crying for a week, because every time I would think, even with everything going on in Syria, every day goes on in Syria, there's something huge happening, whether it's on media or not. But still, I felt it's the case of the same thing. People are being killed, atrocities happening, but still there is a kind of world ignorance. And I think if we look wherever it's happening, especially for the victims, people who are living it, they can really feel it, even though you cannot. We are used, especially when you do psychological support, it's you cannot really compare anyone's problem to another. But really, when you tell, if you don't, not compare it, but tell people really what's going on, people, they can make their own comparison, and they can really tell that whatever is happening, whether it's in Syria or Sudan or Burma or anywhere else, it is the same thing. And they can stand together.
I appreciate it. Thank you for that. I think we can all mark this as the moment that a global campaign was started, informed by the experience of Miss Lebanon and a call for world peace, which I think is I'd like to applaud everyone for ending with a humorous note as well, but actually a very, very serious one, insofar as I think that part of the outcome of this conversation has shown that in many ways we have made remarkable advances when it comes to civil society and to kind of use the term tools, the tools that we have at our disposal to provide services, to almost act as a state in the absence of a state, to draw attention to situations where atrocities are unfolding or at risk, to document them, to ensure that there can't be denial in the future, and to serve as a call for action, working with partners in government and in parliament and elsewhere. I think one of the challenges, though, I was struck, Brian, when you talked about Burma and you said a coalition for 20 years. That we are talking about cases that in many situations are protracted, where the resolve to remain engaged with civil society has to constantly be fortified by the assistance of like-minded states, by other partners, but it also has to be given the resources to be able to survive. We didn't talk as much about funding, but I think funding is one of those critical components that underpins the work of all of the organizations really here, and is also important insofar as something that Brian alluded to before, that's also one of the tools, restrictions right now in funding, that's being used to shut down civil society in exactly the countries that we need to be seeing more light cast on and more information coming out of and more support given to local actors who are dealing on a daily basis with the realities of the horrors of these types of atrocities that are unfolding or at risk. So perhaps if there is a movement, the one thing that it can do at this point is ensure that every single day it stands in solidarity, and that each of us in the work that we do continues to do that, to ensure that we are here to be able to speak truth to what has happened, and that no one can in future decades say that no one knew, and that there wasn't, as you said, the tools available. There were. What did not exist was the political will to act. So with that, I would like to turn it over to Cameron. Thank you. Thank you for the conversation.
Thank you, Naomi. I'm just going to take 30 or 40 minutes to recap the day. I want to thank our panelists. I thought I was going to run out of gas, but you guys were just fantastic, and I'm just in awe of all of your work and all of your stories, and I'm proud to have you on the stage and to call you friends and colleagues and partners, and just grateful for what you do, and frankly grateful for what all of our panelists all throughout the day have done. It's literally, I think, just hundreds and hundreds of years of people's professional lives and personal commitments to creating partnerships and ending genocide. And so it's been, for me at least, I think a very gratifying day, made more so by the intelligent questions and engagement of our audience. I always say that at the Holocaust Museum we have the most engaged audience of anywhere I go. And I acknowledge that I have some bias in saying that, but I do think it has the benefit of being true. So I want to thank you all for spending the entire day with us and sharing your thoughts and experiences. In the spirit of true partnership, I want to put in a plug for some of our partners because this conversation is going to continue beyond the walls of the museum. It's actually, for the truly intrepid, going to continue at 6 p.m. this evening, where the American Red Cross is hosting an event entitled Combating ISIL, Achieving Justice for Sexual and Gender-Based Violence Crimes. It's at the American Society of International Law's Tiller House with a reception to follow. So that's tonight. And tomorrow, if you want the doubleheader, the museum, this museum, my museum, is partnering with the State Department's Global Criminal Justice Office for a panel discussion, which I'll be moderating if you're not too tired of me, on opportunities for justice and accountability, new mechanisms for addressing sexual violence and other atrocity crimes from Europe to South Asia to sub-Saharan Africa. So that's like the whole world. The event will be held in the U.S. Capitol Visitor Center, room 215, and Charlotte's going to be there too, right?
And most importantly, Zeynep Bangura, who
Yes.
was, I think, met with Assad. It's extraordinary. Anyway, you can talk about her, but she's...
Tremendous panel tomorrow, and I hope people will come out to that. But I'm very grateful for having you all here today, and thank you for coming.